Yeah. Linda called me, and I said we just got to get the police involved if that's the
another one,
case.
too, about the people that did the washing on 3400 block, the power washing. One of the business owners said hired them again.
This was their sub. It wasn't even
They
Excel.
did. He said they did a great job, and they came back and cleaned up, and you washed the splatter off the windows and stuff like that. And,
On behalf of Excel?
yeah.
They're doing the gas line replacement up in our neighborhood. They have those old steel lines, and this is the one that Huron and Shenango blew up underground, and it actually spraying fire out of the valve box.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
That'd be fun to watch.
Yeah. So they had to dig it up. They had to turn it off and dig it up while it was still kind of
burning.
Yeah. But those old steel lines, they've just failed. I mean,
Wow.
who would have thought of putting stainless steel?
Oh, is it even stainless?
Stainless steel gas line. When stuff shifts and moves, and I mean, I recognize they've probably been in there since 1980, but yeah, they just
Yeah,
they're
well,
failing.
they were probably thinking it wasn't going to oxidize.
Yeah, oxidized. It oxidized. They didn't do.
Why would they not use black pipe?
Well, that's what they're using.
Black pipe rusts quicker.
They're using the flexible plastic now, and that seems to work okay, but it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it is.
Doing all that boring.
Except now they got cool tools to do
They
that.
do have some cool tools to do that. Yeah.
Just go right under the street and not have any disturbance.
But it's kind of amazing, when you go home for lunch one day and you see flames coming out of the ground, and like, that shouldn't be happening.
It's the Olympic torch.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, boy.
You like those? I do. Those are neat. They don't have the little heels and the little sparklies, but they'll do.
Mayor, I think we got the school issue worked out. We had the city school committee today, too.
Okay.
And had a good conversation with them about study session versus coming to talk. Although tonight, there are two speakers. They're off for tonight.
Oh, good.
But they're going to come back October 3rd, which I said is fine for public comment.
Very good.
Okay.
Did they cancel
I
tonight?
was going to
Yeah,
keep that
the
list,
two-
though.
Scott Gorski and
Wayne Tucker?
Wayne Tucker. They'll be back October 3rd.
I'm sure they will.
Scott, what's
They're not coming to
I thought you
You seen that Cheryl lady came off as well for tonight?
because it wasn't timely.
I haven't heard back from her.
Yeah, I think she's coming off. Let's see, follow it up with her today.
They were hoping for a back and forth
Okay, yeah, I
conversation.
know we're not for lack of ever trying to work with her on that one. Yeah,
Personal visit.
he did.
Yeah, for their 5 minutes.
Speaking of going back, Joe. We do it for them, we have to do it for everybody.
Did you?
We do it for them, we have to do it for everybody, right?
That's okay.
You know, I
know you
apologize.
like
I have been having
surprises
some
way
issues with my
better.
voicemail. I did not get your voicemail.
That looks like a nice seller.
Last time I called it, they said it wasn't set up yet.
I have been having problems with AT&T, my friend. They're giving me free phone service. Yeah, they messed up my
Yeah,
freaking
that's
voicemail
their
for like the
standard,
fourth time.
how they fix things. They give you a service for free for a little while.
Yeah, that's right.
No, I'm not totally opposed to it, but
Looking at the full
I'd
year
like a
past
working
5.
voicemail. I fear, it's.
That would help.
Dang. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Lorette. I'll take a look at what the heck's going on. I thought I got it resolved. I assume you meant from this weekend.
It's not uncommon for me to get my voicemail like a day or 2 days afterwards. All of a sudden it'll go ping, 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 and then I got a million, and it was
Are
from
you with AT&T
Facebook.
as well?
Uh-huh.
Really?
I might have to switch service.
Verizon.
I'm thinking about it. I
I
never had
love
problems
Verizon.
with
They're a little pricey,
my
but
voicemail with Sprint, but their coverage was awful, and so now the coverage is better, but my
Verizon's
voicemail.
way
He was
better.
with Sprint, you said.
Yeah, Sprint's coverage was awful in Denver.
Yeah.
But they never had problems with voicemail, so I took that for granted. I got all my messages in a timely manner, which is becoming an issue.
And that'll happen with text messages also from time to time.
No way.
Oh, yeah. You'll get them like 2 hours after they were sent, or even a day after they were sent.
God, how long have you been dealing with that?
They're a lot better than they used to be, but I've had AT&T now for 8 years.
Exactly. I switched to them for the better. That's the whole point.
It's too lazy to go hunt for another service, port the phone, and
Yeah, remember, I gotta fix that clock. Something's wrong with it. It's just.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much ready. Hey, ladies, are we recording over there? That's okay. Hey, ladies, are we recording over there? Good evening, everybody. I'd like to go ahead and call this meeting to order. Welcome, everyone, to the City Council study session. Our first agenda item of the evening is the financial report. Director of Finance and Administrative Services, Kathleen Wrinkle, is here to discuss the August 2016 financial report. Good evening.
Good evening. I'm happy to report it's anticlimactic, which is very good for a budget report. So in general, we are on target. Last month when I reported, we actually had about $131,000 positive gap between what we expected for net on general budget and where we are actually ending up. This month, it's down to $101,000, so we've eaten into that a little bit, but we're still on the positive side of meeting budget, and we're on target. So, with that, all the numbers are pretty much in line. The larger negative numbers you might see on the front page in the top section where it says governmental types of budgets under the year-to-date city funds. Those are basically in the general fund, the transfers out to some of the other funds that are detailed on page, I saw it here. And I've done this twice, past the page 3 times. The bottom of page 4, they're detailed. And the rest of them are encumbrances for the other funds. So those are POs that have been written and we're just waiting to pay on them. So that encumbers the money. On page 5, we are still in line with our fund balance policy for general fund. And then on page 8, I'd like to chat a little bit about Area 7. We are improving. We are still under where we experienced last year, but we added another $92,000 this month. We were up about $100,000 last month, and then down the months before that by about $100,000 each. So, with that, that's pretty much a summary. The rest of the numbers are here for your pleasure. If you've got any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Questions or comments from council? Seeing none, appreciate you giving us an update here.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Move on to agenda item 2. With a charge, you know. That's the dissolution of Ironworks Urban Renewal Area and discussion of future of Urban Renewal Authority. Community Development Director Brad Power is present to discuss the future of the Urban Renewal, as well as some Urban Renewal members. Our chair, Mr. Costello, as well as Mr. Burns joining us this evening. Thank you all for being here.
Good evening. Could I get that song played every time I speak to you?
We got it queued up as your intro song.
I appreciate that.
Like the Rockies.
Good evening, Mayor.
Yeah.
Yes, my walk-up music. Members of council, we're here tonight to talk about the potential dissolution of an urban renewal district, but we also want to have the opportunity to at least introduce a discussion about maybe some longer-term issues associated with the Urban Renewal Authority's role going forward in the community. We put together in our staff memorandum some pluses and minuses, pros and cons of the consideration that may be before you in the coming months or so to address the issue about the dissolution of this authority or this urban renewal area. And a lot of it's related to the issue of tax increment financing and how that works and whether it would be applicable in this district or not. And before we go into the discussion and questions and answers about the idea and the pros and cons and anything you want to address to us relative to that analysis, what I thought I would do, if you allow me a brief visual aid, which is hand-drawn as well, is to talk a little bit about a very generalized version of how tax increment financing works, just so that maybe we're all on the same page of kind of how it is put in place and what it does over time. So pardon the lack of sophistication of this, because there's a lot of nuances of how it actually works and all the reporting requirements and everything else. But in general, the way that tax increment or TIF works is on the vertical, oh, you're very kind. On the vertical axis, you have revenues, and on the horizontal axis, you have a period of time. And under state urban renewal statute, once you adopt an urban renewal plan, you have 25 years through which you can dedicate the incremental revenues from the area to fund and pay for eligible public improvements. So the theory behind TIF is in an area that's declining, and it's not being subjected to private investment, it's kind of been abandoned, it needs refreshing, it qualifies as blighted under the state statute. The theory behind that is generally revenues are declining. And the idea is to try to reverse that and attract new growth and development to the region. So the orange line represents the time at which an urban renewal plan is adopted and put in place. And that continuous of the red line is the revenues that will continue to go to the so-called taxing entities, RTD, the city, the county, school districts, all of that. That becomes the baseline that they will continue to collect over the period of up to 25 years. And the theory is if you do this and you plan for the public improvements and you fund those public improvements in the area, you're going to attract new redevelopment and new investment. And the theory behind that is the tax revenues would start to increase. So the shaded area here is the so-called increment. And this amount of funding is available for eligible public improvements associated with an urban renewal project. Now, as it relates to the Englewood Industrial Urban Renewal Area, as we covered in the memo, it was adopted the very first part of 2001, so it's approaching 16 years in terms of its active age. And there's been no funding of public improvements associated with anything that's happened out there in terms of redevelopment. So the issue relative to this district is we've consumed a lot of the time that's eligible under the state statute to fund improvements. And the other challenge is that we may be here, plus or minus in terms of time, but we're also about here in terms of the revenues. Because of the recession that happened, the assessed valuation has actually gone down from this solid bar base. And so in order to fund any public improvements, we would the new investment, new development in the area would have to bring us back up to this line, and then it would have to go positive in the time that's left to fund improvements. So it's not an unchallenging situation. If the city wanted to do something out there from a tax increment financing standpoint, we have, by the time we would ramp up and have a project, there's both limited time left in the plan, and you cannot extend your renewal plan. It would have to requalify as blighted. And based on the projects that have happened with RTD and the 2 housing projects that are underway, it would not requalify. So we can't extend the timeline. And there's also, as I said, a limited amount of income that's likely to be generated through the tax increment that's remaining. One of the things that we as staff talked about today that is not included in your analysis is in October you'll be seeing from Boulevard Builders on the project at Ironworks a plan for a special metropolitan district to finance some of the improvements associated with that project. One of the things that they will be requesting, which is very typical of these types of hybrid redevelopment districts, is an agreement with the Urban Renewal Authority that if they do a special assessment in the area to fund their improvements, that wouldn't be subject to any tax increment. So in other words, they can fund themselves, and it wouldn't be subject to any kind of capture from the Urban Renewal Authority to do other funds. It's just another way of funding and developing the public improvements that are required for that project. Rather than doing this, they're doing it through a special district. So we laid out some pros and cons. We'd be happy to address those as it relates to the specific area. The Urban Renewal Authority did meet last week and discuss this topic, but it led to a wider discussion about what the future might be for the authority and its role going forward. And I think the mayor's suggestion was maybe, in addition to covering this specific topic, at least putting on the table an initial discussion, an initial series of identifying ideas, concepts, questions for the future. And that's why I'm going to ask Bernie Costello to share on behalf of the board a few of his thoughts and their thoughts and reflections on what they talked about last week at their meeting. You were done. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Mr.
very
Costello.
much. I appreciate you having us today. I think the main reason why we're here is just to listen and hear what your concerns are and see if we can be educated a little bit as far as what brought this to the table and why it's an agenda item. Based on what staff has briefed us on and the facts that are included in this memorandum, it was our recommendation that it doesn't seem like there's any real benefit to putting this through a dissolution. And we'd like to keep it in place because we feel that even though there might not be any active TIF investment money that comes to the table, with the development that's around the area, it may spur some other opportunities. And we believe that urban renewal obviously is a tool from our perspective that needs to remain in the toolbox in the places that we currently have it established. So, it's more for us. It's really more of opening up a dialogue and trying to understand why this is an agenda item. Obviously, we realize that if it costs the city money or if there's administrative costs, then we want to know about that, and obviously that would be a concern. But it seems as if, based on the analysis that's presented here, that's really not the case. And so it's our recommendation that the urban renewal boundary remain in place for the duration of the time frame.
Thank you. Open it up for questions or comments from council at this point.
What do you mean by keeping the urban renewal boundary in place?
Well, not making it defunct, yes. In other words, keeping it as is and letting it run its course.
Okay. If you have an urban renewal boundary, if you have an urban renewal area, it's going to collect the increment. You're going to have monies being diverted from other taxing entities, such as the school district, where you have people that are coming in with more children and taking that money away, and that money will be funneled to the Urban Renewal Authority. There is no need for the Urban Renewal Authority if the plan has been completed, if they have no project there, if they have no investment there, no debt there, there's no reason for them to continue to siphon off money from the county, from the city, from the school district, from urban drainage. There's no need for it. So urban renewal authorities are put in place to take care of slum and blight, and if that plan from however many decades ago is now come to an end, then so does the authority, because you don't have a plan. There isn't a project going on.
True, but we don't have a TIF project going on in any of the urban renewal boundaries right now, and so, despite that, the urban renewal authority is still active in positive benefits and redevelopment within the city of Englewood, regardless of the fact that there's no TIF funding coming in.
I'm not arguing that there's a TIF funding. If you get rid of this particular one, then you have the purpose for having an urban renewal authority is to take care of the plan and the project that you're taking care of the slum and blight, not to be in a second arm of like community development. Urban renewal authorities are very specific in their purpose, and once that's completed, then that should go away.
But it's not completed.
And then I'm asking. Because if you have no urban renewal area, if you have no urban renewal project, you have no need to have the board.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think there's two aspects of that. One is, for this specific geographic area that's been established in 2001 as an urban renewal district, the lion's share of the project area between the RTD facility that's been in place for many years now and the two residential projects that are being completed in the next 2 years, say, that doesn't consume the entirety of the area. So there's still other areas within the urban renewal area that have not been subjected to redevelopment yet. Now, I think it's in our staff analysis that given the time left and the timing of trying to develop something and allocate any available TIF for that, that may not be at a scale to fund much. But I think what the board's perspective is why remove that as even a realm of possibility? So one of the things that I think the council consider is if the plan were to be left open and we did reach the point at which we're not here anymore, that we're in here somewhere for the last, say, 7 years of the district, would it make sense to do one of two things? Are there eligible public improvements in one of the other properties that may be susceptible to redevelopment in the future? Do we want to foreclose that opportunity? The second alternative, in the board's estimation, is if you keep the plan open and there is no project, that whatever tax increment monies would flow into the authority, into the fund that would be payable to TIF improvements, the authority could then refund that back to the taxing entities. If there's not a legitimate TIF expense or a project on the table for the remainder of the period of time, those funds could be refunded. Now, on the second question,
To address the first one,
Yeah,
it
of
cannot. It cannot be refunded. Arapahoe County will not take those funds back. That's part of what this court case has been all about. And if once the assessment is made, the school district is backfilled by the state, there is no way. It's exactly the situation that's going on in Littleton, and that is not accurate information. It cannot be given back to the entities where it should have gone in the first place once it flows out. It has to be closed, or the increment is going to come to the Urban Renewal Authority. That can't have an area. Once that area is designated, the money is going to be funneled there, and you cannot return it.
Let's go back to Mr. Power and let him conclude his comments, and then we can make
Oh,
other
I
questions
thought he was done
or
with
comments.
part one.
No, I apologize.
Moving on to part two.
Didn't really have a complete structure there. Go ahead, Mr. Power.
well, I appreciate that. And part two was maybe the existence of the authority as an entity going forward. And I don't think any of the board members, nor I as their executive director, can sit here tonight and say that we have a project area that's on the books that we wanted to bring forward, but it would not be either their recommendation or mine as their director or a community development director to dissolve the authority itself, because that forecloses any opportunity to use that tool at some point in the future. And foreclosing that at this point, I think, is a pretty major step and a pretty major factor in terms of looking at our overall redevelopment scenarios in the future. Who's to say that 5 or 10 years down the road, there may not be an area that will qualify, that we'd at least want to have the tool available to assess whether or not an area geographically would qualify for that type of intervention. And so that would just, I think that's, the board can speak for themselves, but that's kind of another thing that came
The
up last
initiation of another area, if that were necessary, if that comes forward, I believe is the 25 signatures. And in order to create the Urban Renewal Authority, the standard is pretty low, and then you have to meet the standards of slum and blight for that. So I don't think that that's an appropriate, I don't think it would be difficult if those situation arose that we had that kind of serious slum and blight, that we would have any problem with getting another authority. Part of the problem that I'm concerned about is that by not taking this one away and redoing this, letting this end as it should, because it's done, is that we're not coming under the new state laws, where we have to have the other entities that are getting their tax funding taken away, the school district, the urban drainage, the city, the Arapahoe County. The legislature passed that they should have a seat at the table when their funds, when their tax dollars are being diverted away from them. And so I kind of see this as just a way to keep it open with no plan, no debt, everything's been taken care of, and we're just keeping it open so that maybe sometime in the future, and then we avoid coming into compliance with the current law.
So let me be clear. In our evaluation and our pros and cons analysis, we gave you some decision points relative to the specific boundaries of this geographic urban renewal district. The part two that I was addressing was the authority itself as an entity and its dissolution. That's not something we would recommend.
And to that point, because it was brought up about considering getting rid of the authority altogether and dissolving that, as so many communities are, and there are two criteria for that. Even if we dissolved it, it would stay open for at least 6 months, or it has to be pay off its debt. And I was a little concerned that we were not provided any financial information, because that's an integral part of making a decision on this whole.
The authority has no debt, outstanding debt.
Pardon?
The authority has no outstanding debt, and I consulted with the Urban Renewal Authority General Counsel Paul Benedetti. In order to if the City Council wanted to dissolve the Englewood Industrial or Renewal area, because there is no debt, that just requires a resolution of the council itself.
I apologize. Maybe I didn't make myself clear. I didn't say about the closing the plan. I said about closing the Englewood Urban Renewal Authority, period. And in order to do that, even if we made that decision today, they would remain in effect for 6 months, and they have to have resolved all their debt. And since that was one of the questions that was asked, I was surprised that there was no financials given on the entirety of the authority, not just this plan.
Thank you.
There is no debt.
There is no debt in the Urban Renewal Authority right
for the authority at all
At all,
on
to the
anything.
best of my
So all of the money has been paid for the lot and all of that kind of stuff. Okay. All right.
And, just as an I mean, this is sort of why we're here. This was my concern. I think taking the Urban Renewal Authority out of the equation is, quite honestly, one of the biggest mistakes you can make. And I understand that there are a few council members who feel very strongly that urban renewal should not be a tool for the future. But to say that urban renewal cannot and should not be used in a positive way, I think is missing the boat completely. I think if you look at Denver, Arvada, and other areas, I think right now is an opportunity for urban renewal to finally put a future plan in place. With the sale of the Acoma property and groundbreaking there, we finally have some money to do some study sessions and other items and to put forward a plan for future of the Urban Renewal Authority. So
Sorry, I'd like to move on to Rita.
Yeah, I don't want to.
So to, I think I speak on behalf of the entire authority. We would. This is why we're here. We don't share that opinion, and we would argue very animately for the opposite.
Thank you. I would like to move on to Rita.
Actually, I think part of this came about here a while back. We had gone to see, I think her name is Angela Dolph, to have her explain the whole situation about TIF. And actually, I believe, Mr. Keck, you went to visit with her also. And Corbin Sackdal's office, right, okay. So anyway, it is very burdensome to have to try to pay the money back, and obviously we can't. So then what happens to that money that they collect if we can't pay it back? And we can't use it anyplace else but in that area. Is that correct?
If in fact increment were generated by this particular project area and there are no project plans, that money would sit with the URA. In my conversation with Corbin Sackdahl and Monica Babbitt, who's the deputy assessor, they indicated that you could give money back, but you have to enter into an IGA with them to do so, and it may be difficult for those taxing entities to receive the money because of TABOR. It may be considered, in conflict with TABOR rules and regulations. So there are a couple ways to deal with that. Obviously, the money could still remain with the EURA for that, but again, money generated in a project area, in my past experience, should stay in the project area and not necessarily be used elsewhere. But I know some urban renewal agencies do utilize that funding for elsewhere, but otherwise then you'd have to look at creating an IGA to return funds to the taxing entities.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments, Mayor Pro Tem Gillett?
First of all, thank you for your candid presentation. Appreciate that. I just have some clarifying questions to help me out. Right, just to confirm, we've not received any TIF from this project at all, and don't look like we're going to do it anywhere in the near future, but somewhere possibly down the road.
There is a slight chance, but correct me if I'm wrong. We have not collected any increment, and the projections for it are not strong.
Okay. How much area? Because from my understanding, once you build on that area, that parcel of area is no longer, obviously, a renewal authority. Mm-hmm. But how much area are we talking about that could be remained for use of the URA?
It's primarily the surrounding perimeter of the main General Ironworks site, as well as there is no plan right now for the Winslow Crane, and which I believe is also in that area as well. So.
Okay, so right now we're not taking any money away from RTD or schools or anything. It's just a tool that a future council could use should they choose to do so.
A tool that, yes, the urban renewal, or a tool that a developer could use, or if it's in place.
Great, thank you. That's all I have.
As of now, the base valuation, the assessed valuation rather, is $464,000 under the base level that was set in 2001, and that was confirmed by the assessor just last week.
Great, thank you.
And that is simply the assessed value of the entire properties included in the urban renewal area, correct?
In that urban renewal area, yes.
And I guess I just don't understand why you think it wouldn't generate an increment, because certainly it seems like property values are increasing and we're having some improvements there in the near future. Help me get my arms around the projection as far as what we would need to do to get to generate an increment, because $464,000 sounds like a lot of money, but in a large site like that, that's not a huge increase, right?
Well, I'll let Bernie chime in, but I think there's a couple of factors. One is there's a fairly significant chunk of the site that's now tax exempt, which is the RTD facility. So that will not generate any increment for the remaining 9 years. And the second is I think tax increment financing has a little bit of a bias, that it's biased toward favoring commercial development because it's taxed at a higher rate. And so you're generating more revenue return out of a commercial use rather than residential. And the two projects that are going forward are the residential in nature. The other factor, a third factor that I mentioned before, is that when you see the Metro District legislation that will be before you for consideration in October, they're going to be establishing their assessments, and so that will not be subject to increment going forward as well. So that's also a factor that would have to be incorporated in terms of how much income generation would be able to be generated in this area in the remaining 9 or so years in the district.
I would echo that. I think it's based on the percentage of what the residential projects currently take up on that site and the lack of appetite for the developers who are involved to take on the commercial pieces.
But do you guys agree that it seems fairly likely, though, that we'll begin generating increment, though, next year at the next reassessment, even if it were no improvements, just because of the value of property, and now with some improvements seem very likely? Is that fair?
I can't answer that because I think we asked for some information at our last meeting for what that potentially might be. So it's a good question. I can't answer that off the top.
You haven't gotten that information yet.
Yeah, we'd have to actually work with the county to get them to do some projections over those 9 years of what they see in terms of the assessed values going forward.
Lorette, we'll go back to Lorette.
Do you know the total amount of the project for the foundry?
I don't have that information.
According to Corbin Zachdahl, our county assessor, they usually do somewhere between 30 and 40% of the total valuation of the project once they break ground. They have already broke ground. There will be, since we've already made up about half of that loss already, so it's around $250, there will be increment, there's no doubt, generated when they do the assessment, and they do the assessment in January 1st of each year. So it won't come in for this year, but it will be for 2017. There will be increment taken on there. And I appreciate that you think that there are some things that that organization can do, but it's not the purpose of the Urban Renewal Authority to do the things that you're asking to do. And that money just doesn't come from somewhere. It is taken away from the school district. That's the biggest argument that has been made for these urban renewal authorities, which the county, I think, is already short $5 million a year on urban renewal authorities for the money that would have been generated and gone to them that's taken away. If you're going to go ahead and do a residential service, like what the foundry is, and you've got more school children coming in, and we don't have the money going to the school district, it isn't just free money flowing, it's being taken away from other taxing entities that they can't use it. We can't use it for our fire and police, we can't use it for the drainage thing, we can't use it for the county doesn't get their share. That's where that money comes from, and that's a problem for it just to go to the Urban Renewal Authority and just sit there when they have no plan. Along with that, any plan, any change in those plans would have to come back through the council, and I believe the area should be redone if we're going to even think about doing that, which would at least have you come under the new state law so that all the people that are being affected by this, all the taxing entities, have a seat at the table, have a voice.
That's understood, but also to be clear, the Urban Renewal Authority had nothing to do with the development. These are not urban renewal developments. They're within an urban renewal mapped zone, but there's no urban renewal.
And the fact that
development for what's going on.
But the fact that they're in that urban renewal zone, and the reason that there wasn't increment done before was because it was a government entity that went in there. So they're not charged tax. So it didn't create that. The minute that the foundry went in, however, I did not say that I felt that this wasn't a good tool or that I never wanted to see it used. I thought I said that it only takes 25 signatures and the condition of slum and blight, which is what the Urban Renewal Authority is supposed to be taking care of. Not just development, not just things they think they could make better. It's for 11 very specific standards that taxpayers would use that money or funnel it away from their children in their school to go ahead and build something because they believe that's the only way to do it. That has to be held to a pretty high standard. So I just wanted to correct that because I think you kind of misinterpreted what I had said before. So if you want to talk to Corbin Sackdahl, once you get his information, they're pretty convinced that we'll have increment as of January, which is why we had to take care of this.
Linda?
Thank you, and thanks for your work. I have a couple comments, maybe questions too. One would be to those folks who went to some meeting that maybe the rest of us aren't privy to. Could you explain what that was and what was discovered and why? What was the intent of that meeting? Did I just miss something?
What meeting are you talking about?
Whatever the meeting is that these folks are talking about, I think I'd like the city.
I went to an urban renewal meeting that Corbin Sackdahl and Monica Babbitt held in Littleton. I did not believe that it was. At the time, I had already gone to the assessor's office and asked if we were collecting any increment. They said no. I just didn't ask the right question. In the process of watching this, there were about 40 people there, mostly from Littleton, watching this presentation by the county assessor. He put up a PowerPoint that showed where all of the tax increment financing projects were around the area for Arapahoe County. And Inglewood had a dot. And I said, we don't have a dot. And he said, you've got a dot. You have a TIF area. And then later in talking to him...
We have an area, but we're not collecting.
And later when I talked to him, I said, how could we have that? You told me we were not collecting any increment. And he said, that's because you haven't built on it yet. Okay. That was about a month after we had done the foundry.
Approved.
So I was well aware that we were going to have a project that would create increment then. And then all that...
So actually, what I'm trying to find out, because it looks like there's a meeting that's informing some of the council on this one that the rest of us haven't been at. It's okay. Don't get uptight. It's okay. I am simply asking for the information from that meeting before we make a decision so we know exactly what we're talking about from the county's perspective and the school's perspective, because claims are being made tonight from that meeting. So that's all I want to know.
Just to clarify, I did bring that
let's stick with Linda. You're out of
right
order
after
right
the
now.
meeting, and then
we have not been recognized,
Eric
ma'am. Please stop talking.
And talk to him.
We're going to stick with Linda right now.
That's the kind of information that I'd like to make public to everybody.
Okay.
I don't have trouble with this otherwise. I actually do think it's an important tool. I would like to see the finances on it, though, and so that the claims that might be made pro or con are a little bit clearer to everybody, and especially since we have an upcoming decision that is going to influence the future of some of this, it'd be great to weigh them all out together. So to me, this is a great preliminary conversation. I mean, a good beginning, not just preliminary, good beginning. And I guess another question I was going to ask was for Tom Burns, who's watched these over these numbers of years and what you've seen our city use or not use and its implications. I mean, part of what we're doing with the development here and others have had some impact when we choose.
Well,
because I'm thinking long term, because this is long term kind of thinking. We're not just talking 2-3 years.
I agree with Bernie that we should stay the entity and dissolve the tract.
With the industrial?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. And I guess my last... I guess I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm sorry, I didn't see... I think Rita and then Lorette.
Actually, and just to add to that, I actually also happened to be at that same meeting, and I think it might be a good idea for us to perhaps get Corbin Sackdahl here to talk about this so that City Council gets the information from the other side of all of that, because I don't think it's wise for us just to make decisions. I had no idea. I go to some of these meetings just to be educated because I don't understand a lot of this stuff. So I do think it would be a good thing for us to get Corbin Sackdahl here to talk about tax increment financing.
Okay, back to Lorette.
I mean, a lot of this has been in the newspaper. I mean, you've got tons of articles about, the citizens in Littleton going ahead and having a special election.
This isn't about whether I've read the newspaper
let's
or
stick
not.
with
I'm just
Lorette.
trying to get specific information on that meeting. That's all.
Lorette here.
That's all.
That's the specific information on that meeting. They were in the newspaper. They've had a special election getting rid of their Urban Renewal Authority. It was of some concern to me, and so I've been attending those meetings to find out exactly where the overreach was, why the county had a problem with it, why the school district thought it was stealing money from them, and so that I could be more educated.
Thank you.
But that's what prompted it, was just reading the paper.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from council at this point? I guess I would ask council for some direction on this issue. Do we want to have another conversation regarding the increment issue? To continue this conversation, I heard from a member the suggestion of inviting somebody from the county assessor's office. Does the body like that idea? Sure. Seeing a lot of heads sort of nodding.
Are we going to be able to do it before? What's the timeline so that we can do this? I don't know when they do their assessment for the taxes, so that if we have to get back, if the school ends up getting backfilled and stuff, so if we could just do it in a timely manner, whether we make a decision to get rid of the Urban Renewal Authority altogether, or just this particular project, or whether the project has to come back to council. There's quite a bit, so we need to do it soon.
Eric, can you give us an overview, a little bit of some timeline on when this increment may be beginning to be generated and when,
January 1, in the meeting that I had, which was completely separate than the meeting that the two council members went to. Yeah. Yeah, I attended a meeting directly with the assessor and his deputy, and they kind of talked me through how tax increment's done and how they do their projections. And so it's January 1 of each year, and that's whatever's on the ground at that point in time they make an assessment of. And so that's January 1 of 2017 is when increment potentially could be generated. But I did reach out to Corbin Sackdahl and Monica Babbitt, and Monica was out of the office, but I heard back from another one of their employees, and they did indicate that it is correct that it is the assessed value is lower than the base, and so that would need to be made up in this next year. So I think if you were to do a resolution, that's only one reading, so to dissolve the area, that could be done still this year. So I think there would be some time, Mayor and Council, if you wanted to have someone from the assessor's office come and talk about projections and where we are with this particular area. That might not be a bad idea.
Did the assessor's office give you an assessment of whether or not the increment would be beginning in all likelihood in January 1 of 2017?
That's what they said, yes.
Verbally. Mayor, what I would suggest, just to clarify so we have as good information as we can, is when the assessor representative would be in front of you discussing it, it would be optimal if you had a 9-year projection of what they think the increment will be doing in terms of a trend line, because that would lead you to do one of two things. You could decide that based on the fact that if it's substantial, and if the majority of council wanted to, then you could, as Eric said, in one reading pass a resolution to dissolve the Urban Renewal District. Or if you wanted to keep the option open for additional eligible expenses in the future, you could also talk about an IGA situation with trying to refund it. That would lead to those two policy decisions. But it would be very helpful, I think, not only to the staff, to the authority, but also to you as council, if the county could do some projections of where they see the increment headed. That's not something that's in our bailiwick. That's really in their shop.
Agreed. That would be ideal. See what we can get out of them in a timely manner. Obviously, we don't want to delay that meeting for that, but the sooner we get that type of information, I think the better. Linda?
So Have you all met with the county at all in the process in the last several years? Would that be something that would be helpful to you all, maybe?
Absolutely.
I mean, I would encourage that, so that your perspective that you're trying to bring tonight is tempered by theirs, and we begin to see some of the what are the edges of this, what makes it difficult, and then I mean. Just looking at this to begin with, I'm fine with going with what your recommendation is. I am not in favor of dissolving the Urban Renewal Authority. I really think it's an important tool, and we're heading into an unusual time because of the new state law, and I think that's fine. I think we got to learn how to play in the sandbox with some of the new rules and figure out how to do this well. So I think we ought to keep it, but I would need to have a little bit more financial information about why we wouldn't and what the impact is on others, which I want to be good stewards of everything and make sure public education is not robbed by it in particular. So,
just for the council's perspective, I do think that we probably need to wrestle with the increment issue on this particular area first. But if we would like to continue on to a more macro level conversation about the future of urban renewal, I think that's sort of the second conversation that may be likely, but we may need additional information or additional sort of experts to sort of help us with some information on that. Lorette?
To that end, because we can't just dissolve it, the law says it stays in effect for 6 months, and we also have to make sure that they have no debt. And so we would need to have the financial information. While I appreciate you saying that there isn't any, we'd have to have their financials and paperwork so we know that what we're doing, because even if we made the decision to close it, if they've got debt, we can't do it. So, and I appreciated, as a result of Rita and I going to that meeting, Eric met with the county assessor. Prior to that, we were being told that this was not going to happen, so we were a little behind the 8 ball to try and find that information out from the assessor's office and how all of this kind of came about. So I appreciate getting more information, but I'm not even sure that if they keep this plan, any of that plan together, that you can split it out. The court case that happened in Littleton makes it pretty clear that you can't, and the EURA case says you can't just start a TIF area when you want in a section of it and undo it in another. So I don't know whether the plan would have to be redone, what the process would be. So we need to make sure that we know all of what's going on so that we can make the best decision we can.
Thank you. Can we include some of that information for our conversation next time? Some financials and as well as some information on procedure. Other questions or comments from council or our guests this evening? Go ahead, Linda.
I do have one more, and that is what kinds of projects, if anything, have been floating around? I mean, I do think that this one area is going to take off with some, hopefully with this development. I'm hoping it will. But are there things that you've been discussing? I have to recall the minutes from your last meeting were not. When's the last time you guys met?
We met this past.
That was to discuss
last week.
This more, wasn't it?
We have not outlined any specifics on future. There's been in the past some very brief, large-scale overview of what the potential is. We have, been updated to the best that we possibly can. There's still a lot of gray areas in what the new law is and what that would be. But we share the same understanding that we would be going forward with a new, area to be mapped and dealing with all the realities that come along with that under the new law. So we're not trying to extend any areas necessarily that are currently.
Because I think it would be helpful to have some of that as we're thinking forward too, that you've started to do that thinking in a way that's helpful, and
we haven't had any specific inquiries yet in our office about some of the surrounding properties. I think that's partly because they're smaller in size, so you'd have to aggregate some land to be able to do a viable project, but that's not to say that the 2 projects that are underway won't generate some demand in the coming years.
How much is this? I can't. Can also in your report back to us, can we talk about how much there actually is there? Because I don't. Yeah.
As far as acreage?
We're talking about some small parcels on the side, but it's strung out, so it makes it unusual, doesn't it?
It is unusual.
Yeah. Maybe just some conversation about that, the challenges that creates.
12 acres, 12 to 13 acres.
But it's not like a big chunk of 12 acres.
Well, the vast majority of it's already accounted for, so.
Anything else,
Yeah,
Linda? Did you have something else? Loretta, did you have another comment, question?
No, just I appreciate your comment. You're correct. The vast majority of it has been taken care of without urban renewal, without it having to put any funds forward. So, and I appreciate it. It's just such an easy thing to do when we're faced with slum and blight to recreate that I think it'll always be in our toolbox. We just don't need to keep this open, siphoning off money from it. I appreciate you guys coming down, too. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate everybody from the Urban Renewal being here this evening and providing some feedback and for everything you do for service to their community. Thank you, Mr. Power. Any parting words from anyone?
Nope.
Thank you again. We'll move on to agenda item 3. This is a historic preservation discussion follow-up from our meeting with the Historic Preservation Society. Help me sort of identify, Eric, maybe what some of the decision points are here. They obviously made several recommendations for the comprehensive plan. They have made specific requests regarding, museum space?
Yes. They want to have the council consider putting in a historic preservation commission language. They would like museum space in this building, as well as separate from that, the comprehensive plan recommendations, which we could take up at another time once we're working on the comp plan. And also just encouragement for the council to work with CPI, Colorado Preservation, Inc., on looking at some initiatives that could be CLG light-esque, if you will, without all the property requirements that would potentially interfere with private property rights.
Okay. So in my mind, that's probably about 4 major sort of topics: the commission, the museum, the comp plan recommendations, the CLG idea. And so I guess what I'd like to propose to this body here, we've got 45 minutes. Maybe we can just discuss each of them one at a time. Perhaps beginning with the idea of having a body, a commission. I guess I'll kick us off. I'm open to the possibility of working with a new board or commission that would be designated towards historic preservation here in Inglewood. I think this is a body that could be selected by this group and could be looking for partnerships out in the community with owners who voluntarily recognize the substantial historical significance of their property and work with those people to create a process that makes some sense. Open it up for others on the commission idea. Linda.
I would love to see us have a commission of some sort. I would not want to conflate the Historic Preservation Society with it, and I don't think that's what they're asking for either. But I don't want them to get stuck in a position where we're trying to make some decisions about properties and history and so forth, and then the Historic Society ends up being tagged with that. But I think the commission needs to be an autonomous group from that and something that is appointed. I would like, I know I'm probably the only one here. I don't think the CLG is as bad a group as you all, or lots seem to think it is. There are many cities that have used it and not created any kind of next step of, taking land or anything. It's simply to set up clear definitions of things that then aesthetics and different design things could come from. And at this point, we don't have anything like that. I think it could be a really helpful group for us overall. But I realize that I'm probably definitely in the minority on that. So I'm fine. I would like to see us start some kind of a commission on this. I think I've been asking for that for a number of years.
Thank you. And I'm happy to have other members sort of weigh in. Again, we are trying to just focus on the commission conversation first, but we can loop back around to the CLG.
Well, isn't that what yeah. Oh, okay.
No, fair enough. And I'm happy to, again, take all comments as they come. Amy?
I would definitely be in favor of starting a new commission with a history focus. I agree with Councilmember Olson. It might be good to have the Historic Preservation Society separate entity from this, but maybe it could be set up something like they have a liaison with that group to kind of keep the communication open. We would just probably want to define some clear boundaries so the two groups wouldn't be stepping on each other's toes, and it could really help them focus on what each group could focus on.
Thank you. Rick?
Thank you. I'm okay for a board. I guess they're not here to ask, but I still haven't got the answer to why would you, I mean, you already have a board that is functioning well, doing good stuff. I just don't understand why they want it as part of our boards. I mean, I think they're doing well. I'm not opposed to it. I just don't understand the deep benefit of it because it seems like, other than the validity of we're a city board, that's probably the only benefit that I would see. But I don't. It doesn't bother me to have one.
Thank you. Maybe we can turn to Eric for attempted response on that.
Yeah, I actually met with Doug Cohn and several of the members of the Inglewood Historic Preservation Society and asked them the same question. And number one, it is having legitimacy of the city behind its role, but it goes deeper than that. I think also the concern is they have a number of artifacts that belong to the society, and I think their concern is for the long-term viability and sustainability of a body who's not going anywhere to be able to watch over those artifacts and make sure that they're cared for appropriately. They feel more comfortable with a city managing it as opposed to society where people can come and go and maybe take some of those types of things over time. So I think that's a big piece of it as well. And then lastly, which is not insignificant also, is that the Inglewood Historic Preservation Society would not be able to apply for grants on their own because they don't have the financial backing or the legitimacy of a Historic Preservation Commission attached to a city. And so that's another one of the reasons why they thought they would try to obtain that designation.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Steve?
I would show support for creating a board and getting an actual historical, I shouldn't say an actual historical society, but getting a city-ran part of that. And my discussions with Matt Crabtree and stuff, it isn't the intention for them to be able to do all of the historical stuff in this community. They would like to have the city with its own board doing their stuff, and they can help with that.
Thank you. Rita?
I actually am in favor of having a Historic Preservation Commission also, and I do think they asked for representation from the society on the board, but not that the whole board would be moved over, and that I think they intend to continue in the mode that they are right now, but then it would they would have representation on council also, or with council.
Thank you. Lorette?
I think at the meeting that we attended, they had mentioned that some of the a legitimate board being set up with the city would give some credibility to some of the grants and the projects that they're trying to do, and so they bemoaned that a little. We can't, I wouldn't be in favor of us setting any guidelines or boundaries at all. They are their own private 501c3. They're their own organization. We have no control over the historic preservation. But if we do a board, then we make the decision who gets on there. They have asked for representation, but we can't set up anything, guidelines between, we have no control over them. They're their own organization, and they'll remain that. I think Eric's made a good point that they've also said that they have had some concerns about the stewardship over some of the material, and that might be a little bit more consistent and stable with the city board. And then, of course, if it was a city board and our stuff, we'd have to house it, and we'd have to take care of it, and we'd have to. So, I mean, but I get their point. Otherwise, the concern in the past is that some of it's been pilfered, or all of a sudden it ends up somewhere in somebody's attic or whatever, and they pass, and nobody knows what it is or where it goes, and so you lose that chain of kind of custody of who all it belongs to. So that might be a good reason. I'm totally in favor of having a historic board.
Thank you. Go back to Linda.
I think that Rick asked a really important question and is really at the crux of this. Why are we doing this? It's not to legitimize them, because I think they're legitimate in their own right. It is to actually take further what they cannot do as a society and do it within the name of the city and make decisions that I think are hard and that have to be done by councils in the future and by citizens coming forward with public dialogue around how historic sites are preserved or not, how they're developed or underdeveloped. And I think this would help tremendously to have this board. We would have benefited greatly from it in the past, particularly thinking about the depot. Neighborhoods like Arapahoe Acres would certainly benefit from this, at least to get some direction or know the city's going to be moving forward and helping them on something or not. I think I think the hard thing about this is I think we're not going to just develop a board that just sits there. It's got to have some teeth to it, or we're going to have to give it some kind of, maybe first year is just a scan of the city of what is historic, what isn't, and I'm sure the Preservation Society would love to help with that. But I think I think we have to see it as going further than what we're usually comfortable with. And it's not, I think if we keep talking about land takings, we're never going to make some bold decisions about preserving parts of Englewood that need some reconsidering, and having design ideas that might be important for some areas and not others. So I think there are so many cities around us that have done this. Denver's done it in some tremendous areas. Littleton's done it. That this would be, I think it's a good time to do this.
Thank you. Loretta, did you have something else on the commission?
No.
And I would say that, I think we do have some consensus around this. I'm hearing from the council that certainly this is going to be a separate entity from, the 501c3 that currently exists, and that they would be applying through council for council appointment, and that they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but any member who would be appointed would need to go through a process of applying and being appointed by this body. So I guess we'd like to see some language sort of coming forward. I think the reason why, I think, is a recognition of this council that our historic history is unique and is one of our sort of unique selling points of our community. And I think that the initial mission of this body, at least at the very beginning, would just to be look for opportunities to highlight our historic significance here in the community. I think they can bring those sort of ideas forward to this body one at a time, and we can sort of decide how deep we want to go sort of down this rabbit hole, if you will. But in my mind, the mission would be relatively broad at first, just looking for opportunities for historic preservation in the community. Again, my intention with all historic preservation issues are really to do them on a voluntary basis. I'm not looking to tread on anybody's private property rights. I'm looking for voluntary partners who recognize the historic significance of the property they already own and that we can work with to preserve some of that unique and desirable history that the city of Englewood has. Further comments or questions on the commission before we move on to the museum idea? I'd like to move on to the museum idea. I'm very supportive of this concept. I think that it's difficult to provide a separate facility or space. So I think what we're looking at really is a display that exists within a current municipal building and area. The library seems to make a ton of sense. They have been working with Dorothy Hargrove down there to do a basic display in one of the areas. It's very attractive. I think the slides that we saw from Cahoots give us an idea of what a display could look like. A timeline type of display could be very attractive, and again, I think really help people see us as a uniquely desirable place to be and see that unique history that we are so proud of. Rita?
What happened to the suggestion that they would be sharing some of the space with the Museum of Outdoor Arts? Is that off the table?
No, it's not. Actually, as I had met with, again, the membership of the Historic Preservation Society, one of the concepts I threw out was to use some space up here in the second floor, specifically as you look at the courts, the area to the left there, utilizing that, putting some demountable walls in with a display there, and that still would be on the table in my mind, and we would have to work with the MOA to afford that space, to utilize that space, but I think that could be done.
Because they have contractual right to use that space,
They,
right?
they do, and the agreement that they have with the city. But I think in conversations with the, I believe Mr. Robinson's actually talked to them, they would be open to sharing some space.
I think we can have that conversation if this council says, hey, this is something we can explore. I would think that the city manager's office could explore those possibilities a little more in depth and could come back with some of those options. So I think it's certainly something that can remain on the table and is open for discussion this evening. Rick?
I'm 100% supportive space.
Thank you. Thank you. Amy?
I love the idea of a museum. I think that would be really great. I know the library also has a lot of old historical material, and the library board has been talking about digitizing that, so that might be a good kind of first tier task, if you will, of those items, because that is a really big undertaking. But it would be nice to have more than just a physical space to view these historical items. If we could somehow put it online so people could also view it online, I think that would be great. And when I think of a museum, one of these things makes me think of the sort of museum at Red Rocks. Have any of you seen that? That's just what one of those things makes me think of. It's pretty cool. Yeah.
It is very cool. I kind of envision something similar because, like I said, it's kind of a timeline you can kind of walk through and say, hey, this is where we started and this is where we are now. Steve?
I would be in favor of having museum space. A standalone location I don't think is really necessary, but the display case done in an artistic and creative way I think could be very beneficial to our community. And frankly, it could help spruce up some of this bare walls we have around here.
Linda?
I was thinking of they want to establish this walking tour of Englewood as their own society, which I think would be really cool for them to do and for us to partner on that. But I was thinking of a walking tour in the building, actually downstairs when you come in and from this side with the little trolley down there. I think it's a great opportunity to do a whole bunch more there with it. It's unused space. It's such an unwelcoming, weird place other than that vacant trolley. But I think, why not announce the whole thing as History Englewood when you walk in those downstairs doors, and then create some kind of a walking thing that goes up and around. And I don't know if we have enough to do that with, but if we get going enough on it, people will start to surrender things. I mean, if you saw the Black Smithsonian just opened this last, where it's opening soon, it was amazing the things people gave once they knew it was really there, stuff that they've been holding on to for a long time and didn't know what to do with it, that's valuable in its own right, but now all of a sudden it's open to the public for all of us to see for free. That's the kind of stuff that should happen as this gets kind of creative and going. So I'm in favor of creating some kind of a walking tour and something. I don't think they need a room or something, because I think that will just make it be, no one's going to go to it. But I think if you embed it, it'd be really cool.
Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, something else along those lines. The Cultural Arts Commission has talked about, has kicked around an idea about expanding the art bus, the art shuttle, to kind of incorporate historical sites throughout Englewood, and said it would be really maybe kind of cool if at some of the particular historic points in the city we put some kind of like photo display or something of what it looks like before, or historical facts about the locations. That's just another something that the Cultural Arts Commission has kicked around.
Yeah, I love that idea. Like you said, we do a good job with embedding some art, but maybe there needs to be some embedded information for historical significance as well. I love that. I'm hearing pretty broad support for finding some space for this type of a display. It sounds like council wants to kind of chew on some more opportunities. We heard some really good ones tonight about using the foyer there where the cart is. We heard some comments about the second floor, at the library, inside the library. I think these are all very reasonable ideas, so perhaps you guys could come forward and bring us some what you guys recommend as far as space and maybe some alternatives that we can kind of chew on and kick around as a group to find out what we think is going to be the most beneficial to the community. The separate issue, I suppose, is ownership of historic materials. if we did start taking stuff from folks, I would think that we would want a policy in place. I think, part of what's happened in the past is that folks were collecting things from people in the community, both from a nonprofit as well as the city sort of ended up with some of it. And I just think that we need to decide what we want to take, first of all, very clearly, so that we're not taking stuff that we're not wanting and sort of having to steward that in perpetuity. And then number two, how do we deal with these things?
This is why you need a commission to decide.
Exactly.
Great recommendation. This could be one of the first things they can be doing. It's a great point. Thank you, Linda. That's a good idea.
That's why you do a commission.
There you go. So that could be something perhaps we could task them with as a recommendation on a policy on that that could come forward to the city. I'd like to move forward to the...
Can I just add one thing on that? With that, the Cultural Arts Commission also had a big undertaking recently, in the last probably 2 years, to archive all of the art that the city owns. And they started from scratch, and they started, with the spreadsheet. Where is it? Who donated it? Who does it belong to now? All those kinds of things. And then they uploaded it to, I think it's a public art archive, so it's an online inventory, so that if any of the members in the future need a reference, where it is, who owns it, how much it was paid for, whatever, it's all in one place. So that might be, I'm sure there's some kind of comparable online tool for historic information.
Great, and perhaps creating that comprehensive list for us might also be one of the things that they could kind of work on initially and sort of identify what they think is substantial, and so we can start to consolidate that. And I think the Preservation Society started working on something like that, and so I think we can kind of coordinate, maybe pick up where they left off on some of those projects. Again, I'd like to transition us to the CLG, the Certified Local Government discussion idea. I'll kick us off, I guess. I am generally open to the concept as well. I certainly, in my opinion, don't want anything that, again, is going to infringe on folks' private property rights. I'm looking for something that works with voluntary property owners currently. And I think that in the presentation that we saw that was scheduled by the Historic Preservation Society, we saw that there's a whole range of possibilities with CLG, all the way from very heavy regulations that would infringe on people's rights, that is very controversial and I think needs to have a long-term discussion, versus all the way down to something that has very little teeth and looks for just voluntary opportunities, which is the more of the end of the spectrum that I would, be interested in. I don't think we necessarily have to go down the CLG route. I think it's one of the possibilities for us. But I don't think, as long as we stay on that voluntary end of the spectrum, that it shouldn't be too difficult and could be a viable tool for us. Rick?
Thank you. I'm not a proponent of CLG. My first experience with dealing with a property designated as historic was a house, a private owner house. The owners died, and so it was put up for sale. And the estate could hardly sell this house because it was, number one, functionally obsolete. Anybody who wanted to buy it would want to change. It was a 100-and-some-year-old home that needed drastic up, and they had so many rules that I think it was, last I checked, it was, hadn't been sold for 6 months. And I worry that, something like that could, that may not be the intent of me and my wife, but if my kids try to sell and I go, what'd you do to me? Now you've made it to where I can't sell this house or pay up the amount on the estate. I worry about those things, and I definitely am concerned that while I trust just about everybody here, who do we know is going to be running in the future? Could the robots just be saying, put the house under? I don't know. I'm just obviously being facetious. But I'm just concerned about that aspect. I'm uncomfortable with the government or local entities dictating what should be and what should not. I agree, if you want your home, and you find benefit, just make sure the heirs of that property understand what you're doing and how to deal with it as well. That's all I have. I personally would not like to go that route.
Thank you. Linda?
I wanted to ask Rick a question. So was that recent that happened to you, or is it a little?
It was 10 years ago.
Okay, because I think the rules have changed. So I know of several properties, only from some other things, that have had some pretty strict restrictions, and they were able to actually make some changes because they didn't have the environmental things that they needed. They weren't ADA compliant, and yet they were open to other people. And they're meant to be homes open to other people too. But I think we should look at that. So I mean, no, I don't think anybody wants anyone to get in that situation. But if parents do it, that's again voluntary. They chose to do it on that house. You're right. They should talk to the kids, but maybe that's why they did it. It's because they knew the kids would not. But I do think there are some benefits to the CLG in terms of grants that we are going to need if we're serious about this. And I love it that under their slide under live, I know we're getting off, but they're talking about in the comprehensive plan suggesting retain historic character and form in our established neighborhoods. What does that really mean, and how do we do that? It's really one thing for someone in Arapahoe Acres to say that, and then a next-door neighbor say, but wait a minute. So I think a CLG could help give us access to data from around the country, different kinds of neighborhoods. We don't have to make any laws from it or any new zoning or overlays or anything. It can simply be, and you can unjoin it, I think, too. So I don't think if you decide this thing doesn't work for us anymore, we don't do it. But I think there might be a lot of, I'd love to hear from them again, and particularly have cities that haven't used it to the extent that some people are worried we might use it. But if there's another entity, I'm open to that too.
Other questions or comments regarding CLG?
I mean, didn't Lakewood join? And they haven't done anything for like 3 years. It's helped them think through what they're trying to do for the commission. That's all. That's all they've used it for. It also allows them to go after grant money if they do want to do something. So I think most people in Englewood we're not going to get a majority of people wanting people to involuntarily giving up their homes.
You know, and I agree. I think that, Rick, the nightmare scenario you pointed out, I think would, certainly want to be avoided by this body. And my intent of going down this road is not to have anyone involuntarily end up in that situation. I guess I would wonder whether that situation was a result of a CLG designation or if that was just more of a result of voluntary restrictions put on the deed, either through the federal or state designation process.
I couldn't tell you.
Yeah. No, and that's something that might be helpful to understand. Lorette?
If we're going to go ahead and have the board, maybe we should get that, be one of the things that the Historic Preservation Board takes a look at. Maybe my gut feeling is that they'd be more prone to try to do it, but I would like that more information come from them and see what their feel is, and working with the Historic Preservation Society as well. My first, I attended that meeting for CLG, and I have some real huge concerns about getting involved with that. It's kind of like taking the money for the Paseo. We can't sell that. We got to pay that money back if we ever do anything with that land. I mean, those kind of grants and those kind of monies come with restrictions on them, and how long and how much and how restrictive, and whether it allows us to change in the future, all those kind of things. They said it was a very fluid kind of plan, and you could take as much as you wanted of it, but you could take as much as you wanted of it, but it came with no perks. You had to go all in to really get the grants or the money or the funding and stuff. So maybe that would be a good thing for the board to examine, so we take a little bit of time before we go jump into something. I mean, we've just got the board going. We might as well give them an opportunity to see the pros and cons and the community feel for it, so they could do some outreach as well. Maybe there's a bigger hue and cry for it than we thought. Who knows? Maybe they'll find that out. But we ought to give it a little time before we start burdening them with a bunch of other stuff.
Steve?
My gut feeling is no, although I would say that I'm saying that because I don't understand it. I do have a concern that in certain areas of Englewood, you could get the necessary number to say, yes, we want to create our own little district. And a few individuals within that group would end up having to either, depending upon how strict the policies are, may have to alter their structure to back to original standards. And frankly, I know they do this, but I don't know how they get away with it because we have energy standards now that has to be met. And it's basically physically impossible to hit some of the insulation issues in older structures. There's just not enough space in the roof or in the walls. I do understand that there is money available, and it allows homeowners to take some tax credits and be able to do improvements. It's something that I wouldn't enter in lightly. I would need to know all of the details, the ramifications. Does that kind of answer that question?
Certainly. I think that's appreciated. Those comments are helpful. So, we've heard the recommendation of perhaps, letting our commission sort of weigh in and make a recommendation. I like that idea. I'm open to that idea. I think that there's more than one way to sort of skin a cat here, and I think that, honestly, I feel like what we're discussing is probably more of a stylistic kind of thing of whether we want to call it a CLG or what type of process or what type of entity. And so, I'd be open to working with this new body and saying, hey, what do you guys think is best, and kind of going from there. Others want to weigh in on whether this should be a commission issue or whether it's something we want to kind of deal with separately, like the museum issue. Seems like we want to kind of take that one on our own. Steve?
If I had to make a decision today, the answer would be no. Although there's always a possibility in the future. So I'd defer that. I would defer my answer from today.
So you'd be open to the commission weighing in on this?
Yes, but not making the sole decision.
Of course. Others want to weigh in on that, Linda?
Well, the commission is never going to make the sole decision, right? Can we agree with that?
Well, that's true.
So let's make sure that everyone knows that they won't be deciding anything. Council will have to be the ones who anything goes through, and it would, if it's involved with zoning or overlays or anything, it has to go through planning and zoning too before it gets to us. So I think there are a lot of safeguards along the way. But I think more information would be really helpful. I think that night that most of us were at that meeting in here was really oddly sort of. I thought we were coming to hear the Historical Preservation Society talk about themselves, and then the CLG was kind of embedded in it, and then it was like, oh, wait. I would prefer to hear from them at some point if we're thinking about that, so we have our own independent kind of interaction with them and not hijacking someone else's meeting, because I started to want to ask a whole lot of questions. So, but I didn't feel...
CLG or the Historic Society?
CLG. Yeah, CLG directly because we were here that night, and really I didn't think it was our meeting to try and ask a lot of questions, but I had a lot more questions for them.
I see. Our meeting as in council, not
right.
Whoever
right,
the
right.
entity
it
was
wasn't
that
our
presented.
meeting. Historic Preservation Society had planned it that night, so I would want to do that. But I do think that we're finding reasons to have this commission. And we're going to have to give them some direction, and I hope that we will be the ones who come up with their mission, because I think that will help us decide what it is the scope of their work as a board and commission should be. And we might want to look at a number of others from other cities to see what they're doing, and because I think it could also run the gamut of a CLG-looking group if we're not careful.
So Linda's suggesting perhaps that we take a little bit of a step back and decide, more clearly perhaps what the mission of the commission is, but it sounds like you're open to the possibility of them sort of taking on this idea of a recommendation with the CLG once we kind of get them up and running.
I thought that was a great idea that Laura suggested that once they get going, they should be deciding, helping us decide.
And so I guess I'd like others to weigh in. Can we, wait on the CLG for a recommendation from this body? And does this body want to... I think at minimum this body will see some language coming forward. This body would be, I think, formed via resolution.
I think
by ordinance.
Two others, the Water and Sewer Board, and you have Board of Adjustment.
Thank you. So by ordinance, but that would give us some opportunity to craft some language regarding what their purpose is. Would the council like to go above and beyond what's in that ordinance? Because it's not as clearly stated as a mission statement, but it does give, tons of information about, what they should be doing and why. Is that satisfactory, or do you think that we need some separate, more discussions regarding that scope? I guess I'm asking you.
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Since you made a recommendation.
My point would be, I guess I would encourage our staff to do some research and come up with some plans for us to think about with this. But
I think that's what they'll do. I think they'll bring forward an ordinance for first reading that would give us some opportunity to take a look at the language and start to craft it and change it if we felt necessary. Urban renewal, the reason I bring this up, I guess, is because like urban renewal, they have they were produced by some sort of legal authority, and there's some language there, but they also have adopted their own mission statement, perhaps without the involvement of this body. And so, I guess that's the question of, you brought up the mission statement, so I just was trying to distinguish a mission statement.
I really do think we should be involved in the mission statement, because we could give them a mission we don't agree to, like become a CLG or something. That's probably not what we all want here. So I think we need to toss it around here, make sure we know what we're asking them to do.
How about this?
We could misassign people to it who believe that without a clear understanding, and then they all try and work together on a vision and just have a huge blow up. So I really do think this body needs to at least give some benefit of thought to this.
I think we've done some of that tonight. Again, I guess my recommendation would be, let's see what language comes forward from staff regarding on first reading, and then decide whether we feel like that's adequate language or whether we need to have a separate meeting to discuss the mission statement of this group. Is that fair? I'm seeing a lot of sort of heads nodding. Comp plan information. They did make several recommendations regarding the comp plan. We've also, as a body, been keeping, I think, points of reference to, as we come across areas where we thought there needed to be some incorporation to or reference to historical issues. My thought is that we would pick up that conversation during our next comp plan discussion. Would anybody like to weigh in? We do have about 10 minutes left here. If anybody would like to weigh in on any of the comp plan related issues. Later tonight we will get an update. I believe we're scheduled for an update under City Manager's choice this evening regarding potentially changing structure of study sessions and things. We did discuss that a little bit. So I think something to keep in mind as we consider that change.
I'm fine with that. Whoops, sorry. Oh, I guess it was
go ahead.
Yeah, I think let's do it when we're doing comp plan. Makes sense. Yep. Rather than keep going back over and over it. Yep. But that means somebody's got to have it there with, we're going to have to bring this document when we're looking at that document again.
So we need, the recommendations not only from this body, but we also need to, our cheat sheet of what we've been and there's only been a couple of points that we've identified thus far in our efforts. And so I guess, would this body like to consider those historic issues at our next comp plan meeting, or would you prefer to kind of loop back around to historical issues at the end or as they come up, or does anybody have any preference? Seeing no real strong opinions, I don't think folks want to weigh in on that. So I guess we've got an extended bio break in between our meetings unless somebody else has something. Okay, we'll adjourn. We'll pick this up in about 10 minutes next door.